Hello, ladies. This is Jana Smith from New Braunfels Church of Christ. And this is the ladies' class. And we are going to resume our study of 2 Samuel. And today we are on chapter 18. So if you will open your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 18. My mother taught Bible class on Sunday morning and Wednesday night for about 50 years. And she taught the kings and the prophets. And she made these beautiful poster lessons that the kids just loved. And so one day when I was visiting her in Duncan, Oklahoma, well, I got this bright idea that, I could borrow that lesson and I could use it. And she was all for it. She said, well, it's over at the church building. So there we are, 11 o'clock at night, when you get your best ideas, right? And we're at this dark building, no lights on, maybe just the parking light on. And so I get the key and I jump out of the car and ready to run into the building. And my mother is clamoring out on the other side. She is in her 80s. I'm in my 50s. And I said, what are you doing? And she said, well, I'm getting out. I'm not going to let you go into that dark building by yourself. She said, no, John, who's lurking around those corners? Somebody could hit you in the head and I wouldn't even know it. I said, Mother, what are you going to do? Run them over with your walker? And so we both just kind of start giggling and thought that was the funniest thing ever. We could just see her running down these intruders with her walker on the church parking lot. So, I just gave you that example because no matter how old your children are, you still want to protect them because you love them. Just keep that in mind as we go on. So I'm going to use one of those poster lessons that she made a long time ago as an example of just as a review from last week. And that's when we covered chapters 16 and 17. Here's Absalom. Remember, he's the most handsome man in all of Israel. Not one flaw from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. And he stole the hearts of Israel. He was a great politician for 4 years. And now he has made himself king of Israel, a traitor to his own father. David having to leave Jerusalem in just the most disgraceful way. Coming out, he said, we've got to get out of here or we will be killed with the sword. And so he covers his head, he's weeping, he's barefoot, and the people are weeping as he walks by. And then he sends the priest with the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. He said, if it is God's will, he will bring me back here and I will be with him. So you take the Ark back to Jerusalem. But if you find out anything, you need to send me word with your 2 sons and what I should do when I get to the fords of the Jordan. And then he got some more bad news. Ahithophel, who was his chief counselor, and he held his advice in just with great esteem. It was like his advice came straight from God. He had gone over to the dark side. He was now the chief counselor for Absalom. And that worried David very much because he knew that his advice was so worth listening to and following. And then he meets Ziba. Ziba is the servant of Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, that King David brought to his table every day to eat, and gave him all the land that had been owned by his father Saul, and he had restored him with class and treat him like a prince. Well, Ziba informs David that Mephibosheth did not come because he's waiting in Jerusalem because he thinks that maybe the house of Saul will rebound and he will again might have a chance of being the king of Israel. oh, what sad news that would be. Another kick in the stomach. And then as he walks over the summit, there he meets his good friend Hushai. And Hushai has torn clothes, dirt on his head, because he is so sad for his king. And Hushai said, I'm going to come with you. And he said, no, you would just be a burden to me. What I want you to do is go back to Jerusalem, and I want you to defeat the advice of Ahithophel. That's what I want you to do. And you send word to the high priest, and they will send messengers to me. So the plans are made. And as David and his followers walk along and his mighty men are on each side of him, here comes a man running out, cursing constantly, calling him names, throwing dirt and stones at David and his men. And of course, his men just want to take his head off, especially Abishai. And David said, no, you do not touch him. Do not touch him, because the Lord has put those words in his mouth. Don't you know that David is reliving the 4 things that Nathan said would happen to him? So if you turn to chapter 12, you will find out those 4 things. And just as a review, he says, the sword will never depart from your house, because you have despised me and taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Behold, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house. And here he is, Absalom, now king, his son, his crown prince, his son that he loves, has taken over the kingship. And Ahithophel says, the first thing you need to do is go sleep with those 10 concubines that David left behind, and do it on the roof where everybody can see. Pitch a tent. Oh, and that's what God said would happen. He said, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of the sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. And then he asked Ahithophel what he should do. And Ahithophel gives him good advice about, you need to go after David now with 12,000 men. But then he said, well, let's listen to the advice of Hushai. And just as God had planned, Hushai's advice was heeded by Absalom. He won the vote. And his officials all agreed that Hushai's advice was the best. Gather troops and go out after David with all your men. And when you do, kill David and his followers. And you would be like the hero going into battle, leading the troops. Oh, it was a beautiful picture. And it just played to Absalom's vanity. He was all for it. So the word was sent with the messengers. They were seen when they were trying to speak to the servant girl. And so the plans kind of fell apart. But soldiers were sent after these 2 messengers that were seen. And they were the sons of the high priest. And so they got to Bahurim, and the woman of the house hid them in a well. Then she covered up the well and put wheat on top of it, or some kind of grain. And then the soldiers show up. But she said, I haven't seen any 2 messengers running through here, 2 young men. They are gone. They're over the other side of the brook. So the soldiers went out after them. And of course, the two messengers got to David and said, you've got to get over the Jordan River today. And by night, they were all on the other side. And they went into the land of Gilead, to the town of Mahanaim. So in Mahanaim, he was met by 3 good friends that brought him all kinds of provisions for his people and for David. What a great time for that to happen. And last week I called it the balm of Gilead. Just that, like the song that we sing, BALM, balm of Gilead, which is a universal cure. And I know that David felt like he had been given a universal cure when he met friends with provisions. But guess who's right behind him? Absalom. He's got his troops going across the Jordan River also. So now David has had time to get his troops together and to face his son Absalom. So if you will open up your Bibles to chapter 18, we'll begin reading there. Then David mustered the men who were with him and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. And David sent out the army, 1/3 under the command of Joab, and 1/3 under his brother Abishai, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai the Gittite. So he has 3 very capable commanders, and he knows that he does, but he remembers what happened when he didn't go to war in the springtime, and so the king says to the men, I myself will also go out with you. It's just like my mother telling me, I'll go out with you. I'm going to protect you. And the men said, oh, no, you're not. But the men said, you shall not go out. For if we flee, they will not care about us. If half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore, it is better that you send us help from the city. So you go back to Mahanaim, you stay there in safety, and if we really, really need you, you can bring more men. So the king said to them, whatever seems best to you, I will do. You know, that would be hard to go out to battle and fight your own son. And I think his commanders realized that. So the king stood at the side of the gate as the army marched out by hundreds and by thousands. So David has accumulated more followers now, more soldiers to fight, because he's had extra time because of Hushai's advice. Just like God planned it. No coincidences. It was all in God's plan. And so they marched out by hundreds and by thousands. Oh, I bet that was a sight. And all because they loved King David and knew that he was the one true king. Isn't that the way it is today? Our King, Jesus Christ, and we love our King. In verse 5, and the king ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai. This is what he says as they march out of the gate. Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders about Absalom. What did he say? Deal gently with my son Absalom. No matter what, we want our children protected. But just like it says in Proverbs 19:21, many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. No matter how we plan it, that doesn't mean that's what's going to happen. Verse 6, so the army went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. And the men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David. And the loss was great on that day, 20,000 men. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword. You know, isn't it strange how God fought for David in unusual ways? Because here he is, his army going against Absalom and his army, and the forest devoured more men than the sword. That must have been a thick forest, kind of like the Black Forest in Germany, where you cannot see. I remember I had my uncle tell me how he had to, when he was at war, they hated, during World War II, they hated the Black Forest because you could not see who was behind the trees, and the trees were so thick, and it was a terrible battlefield. And that's just how I picture it here, that they got tangled up, they fell into ravines and to maybe big holes, and couldn't get out, and were easy prey for David's soldiers. They got separated, they got tangled up. And guess who is separated from all his men? Well, let's read on. In verse 9. And Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. I don't think it just happened to meet. I think this was all in God's plan. Absalom was riding on his mule. What a different picture. You know, in chapter 15, he was riding in a chariot pulled by horses. 50 men ran in front of him shouting, "Here comes Absalom, Absalom, the prince." Now he's on a mule. And as he was riding the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth. And while the mule that was under him went on, and a certain man saw it and told Joab, oh, I can't even imagine all his dreams of ruling the country, and he is caught in an oak tree, hanging by his head. Now, it doesn't say that his hair got tangled up in the branches, but you just have to know that it did. All that beautiful hair probably got tangled up in the branches also. However, he couldn't get out. And he was, you know, he was probably just kicking in thin air up there. And he probably looked up to heaven and knew the doors were closed. And if he looked down to the ground, it probably looked like a huge gaping abyss. And he was not anxious to fall down either. But I wonder sometimes why, you know, he struggled to get out, especially after the young man saw him. And so when this young man saw Absalom, he didn't kill him. He did not kill him. So he went and told Joab, behold, in verse 10, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak. And Joab said to the man who told him, what? You saw him? Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt. And that's a warrior's belt. And it was, you know, or even a chieftain's belt, which was greatly admired. And 10 pieces of silver would last you quite a while. And the young man said, listen, I don't care if you gave me 1,000 pieces of silver. I wouldn't have touched him. So in verse 12, but the man said to Joab, even if I felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not reach out my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai. He said, for my sake, protect the young man Absalom. On the other hand, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there is nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof. In other words, you would have thrown me under the bus if I had killed the son of the king, because I heard exactly what he said, and so did you. Well, you know what? Joab didn't give a second thought. He felt like he was in the right, that if we end the life of Absalom, this whole war is going to be over. It's going to save a lot of lives. Yes, the king said that, but Joab was not listening. And he says, I will not waste time like this with you. You're not even worth talking to. I'm not going to waste my time. I'll take care of it. And he took 3 javelins in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. It didn't bother Joab at all. And the word heart here can also mean in the middle of the body. So Absalom didn't die immediately after Joab thrust those 3 javelins in him. And 10 young men, Joab's armor bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. Just like the 10 concubines that he had taken that were his father's, that showed that that was a traitor, it was treachery. Then he was killed by 10 armor bearers. I wonder if there's any relationship between those 2 numbers. Then Joab blew the trumpet, And the troops came back from pursuing Israel, for Joab restrained them. And they took Absalom and threw him into a great pit in the forest, and raised over him a great heap of stones. And all Israel fled, every one to his own house. So here was Absalom that was so revered by the people and had won the hearts. He ends up in the bottom of a pit covered up with a bunch of stones. That was not the burial of a king. He did not get that beautiful funeral. He didn't have mourners walking behind his casket. He was just thrown into a ravine covered up with some stones. And I think that that was also in God's plan, that he would not be like put up as a hero. He would not be talked about as a great warrior, because they wouldn't even know where he was buried, somewhere tangled up in that forest. And all Israel fled, everyone to his own house. They probably started taking down those Absalom campaign posters real quickly, don't you think? And they probably started putting up David, King of Israel, instead. So, don't you find great relief when things are so stressed that you can go home, crawl in your own bed, and just put the covers over your head and pray to God? And I'm sure that's what those men did. Just grateful that they weren't killed in the battle, and realized that they'd been following the wrong leader. But Absalom, this is so typical of him, because he was a very vain man. Now, Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up for himself the pillar that is in the king's valley. Sounds like he had great plans, since this pillar was in the king's valley. For he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. Now we know that in I believe it's in chapter 14, that we are told that Absalom had 3 sons and 1 daughter. So something must have happened to those sons. They might have been killed in some battle. They might have died from some disease. We don't know. But at this time that he put up the pillar, he had no sons. And so carrying on your name was very, very important. And so he called the pillar after his own name. And it is called Absalom's Monument to this day, when this was written. So the battle is won. Now what? How are we going to get David back to Jerusalem and placed on the throne again? He's got to have everybody on his side, remember? Well, they're excited about telling David that he has won the battle. So especially one young man named Ahimaaz. He was one of the runners that came and warned David that he needed to get over the Jordan quick. I think Ahimaaz could have been in the Olympics, because he is a very fast runner. And he is the son of Zadok, the high priest. And so he goes to Joab and he said, let me run and carry news to the king that the Lord has delivered him from the hand of his enemies. Oh, let me tell him. I just want to tell him. Please let me tell him. And Joab said to him, you are not to carry news today. You may carry news another day, but today you shall carry no news, because the king's son is dead. He said, are you crazy? He said, do you remember when that the Amalekite brought that bad news about Saul and his sons being killed in battle? What happened to that Amalekite? He was killed David had him killed. And do you remember when Rechab and Baanah brought the head of Ishbosheth, thinking they would get a great prize for doing this wonderful thing, cutting off the head of the son of Saul? Well, David had them killed. He said, why would you want to take this news that Absalom is dead? He said, you're not going to do it. So Joab, in verse 21, he said to the Cushite, go tell the king what you have seen. The Cushite bowed before Joab and ran. Now, Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, you know, he just wants to do it. I want to run. I want to tell him, come what may, let me also run after the Cushite. Just let me follow the Cushite. And Joab said, why will you run, my son, seeing that you have no reward for the news? This is not a time to take this news. Come what may, Ahimaaz says, I will run. So he said to him, run. And Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and outran the Cushite. Well, Ahimaaz just took off anyway. And he outruns the Cushite. He goes by the plain. So he is a fast runner. Now, who did we leave by the gate? Well, we left King David, and he is waiting for news. You know, have you ever waited for news? Especially this kind of news, life and death. So I can't imagine what David, he's probably been praying and praying that Absalom, his son, is safe. And then he probably hopes that and prays that the men that have followed him have won the war. And you know that he is remembering the things that Nathan told him was going to happen in his lifetime. So in verse 24, it says, now David was sitting between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof of the gate by the wall. And when he lifted up his eyes and looked, he saw a man running alone. And it's got to be Ahimaaz. And the watchman called out and told the king. And the king said, if he is alone, there is news in his mouth. I mean, that's what they would do. They didn't have, cell phones, and they didn't have Zoom, so they would just send a runner. And he grew nearer and nearer. And the watchman saw another man running. And the watchman called to the gate and said, see another man running alone. And the king said, he also brings news. And the watchman said, I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. You could tell it's probably running so fast it had to be Ahimaaz. And the king said, oh, he's a good man and he comes with good news. Oh, of course, you're going to hope for the best, right? And then Ahimaaz cried out to the king. He's probably, some distance away, and he starts screaming, all is well. And he bowed before the king with his face to the earth and said, blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my Lord the king. So he said, for those men that fought against you, you have been delivered. And the king said, is it well with the young man Absalom? And Ahimaaz answered, when Joab sent the king's servant, your servant, I saw a great commotion, but I don't know what it was. So Ahimaaz is a good runner, but evidently he didn't have the nerve to report all the news. Wasn't a very good messenger. And the king said, turn aside and stand here. So he turned aside and stood still. He just couldn't tell him. And behold, the Cushite came. And the Cushite said, good news for my lord the king, for the Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all who rose up against you. Same words. But the king asked the same question. He didn't ask about Joab and Abishai and his commanders and how many men did I lose. The first words out of his mouth was, is it well with the young man Absalom? And the Cushite answered, just like a true politician, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man. Then David knew that Absalom was dead. And of course, he starts grieving. And in verse 33, chapter 18, and the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. For there are ones of us that have lost grandchildren and children. How many of you have said the same thing? It wasn't Ahimaaz and Jonathan, the sons of the high priest, that came to our house one night. It was deputies of the sheriff. And the deputies came in and delivered their bad news to us, that we had lost our only granddaughter, Lindsay, in a car accident. And I remember Joe saying right then when he heard the news, Lord, why didn't you take me? Why didn't you take me? It should have been me. And of course, that's exactly how we react. We would give up our lives for our children. We would do it gladly if we could, if we had that power, but we do not. So, you know who does? Jesus. Jesus did it. He gave up his life for sinners like me and you because he has that power and not us. And we are to be grateful because now we can have a home in heaven because of Jesus' choice to give his life and not take ours. I will leave you with that thought. God bless you.